When Neil rescued a dog in distress after a storm, he never imagined its owner would turn out to be a very generous woman. When they finally met in person during the handing over, what happened will leave you amazed. The storm hit Austin, Texas on a Wednesday evening with the kind of fury that made weather forecasters use words like unprecedented and dangerous, which in Texas means you should probably move your car to higher ground because the flash flooding was going to be biblical. Neil Carpenter had been driving home from his shift at the auto parts store where he worked as an inventory manager, a job that paid his bills but didn't exactly inspire passion, when the rain started coming down so hard his wipers couldn't keep up and visibility dropped to basically zero. He pulled into a gas station parking lot to wait it out, watching water accumulate in the streets with alarming speed, turning intersections into shallow rivers that swallowed storm drains and kept rising. After 20 minutes, the rain let up enough that he could see again, and he started driving home slowly, navigating around debris and flooded sections of road, taking detours through neighborhoods he didn't usually drive through. He was about 2 miles from his apartment when he heard it, this faint sound that cut through the noise of his engine and the residual rain, a sound that was definitely organic and definitely distressed. He pulled over near a large storm drain, the kind with metal grating that was designed to handle runoff but was currently overwhelmed by the sheer volume of water, and the sound was coming from down there, echoing up from the darkness in a way that made his stomach clench. Neil got out of his car, the rain still coming down but lighter now, and walked to the edge of the drain. The sound was clearer now, unmistakably a dog, barking and whimpering in alternating bursts that suggested injury or panic or both. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down through the grating, and about 8 feet down he could see movement, something dark and wet struggling against the current that was still flowing through the drainage system. "Hey buddy, you stuck down there?" Neil's voice felt stupid, echoing into a storm drain, but talking seemed better than just staring. The dog responded with more frantic barking, and Neil could see it was a medium-sized animal, maybe a terrier mix, pressed against the side of the drain where the water flow was less intense. The grating was secured with bolts that had probably been there since the drain was installed decades ago, rusted and stubborn, but Neil kept a basic toolkit in his trunk because his car was old enough to require frequent roadside adjustments. He grabbed a wrench and a crowbar, came back to the drain and started working on the bolts, which resisted like they'd been welded in place by time and oxidation. It took him 15 minutes to loosen them enough to lift the grating, his hands cramping and his shirt soaked through from rain and effort, but eventually he got it open and stared down into a hole that looked significantly deeper and more disgusting than he'd hoped. The water was still flowing but not rushing, reduced to a steady stream that ran along the bottom of the concrete tube, and the dog was about 8 feet down, clinging to a small ledge where debris had accumulated. Neil was 34 years old, not particularly athletic, and hadn't climbed anything more challenging than a ladder in years, but he couldn't just leave a dog to drown or die of exposure in a storm drain. He lowered himself into the opening, his feet finding purchase on the slippery concrete walls, and worked his way down using a combination of bracing against the sides and controlled falling, landing in water that came up to his shins and smelled like everything terrible that gets washed into storm drains during floods. The dog watched him approach with eyes that reflected his phone's flashlight, and as he got closer he could see it was shaking, either from cold or fear or both, its fur matted with mud and debris. "Okay buddy, I'm gonna pick you up now, try not to bite me, because that would really cap off this whole experience." Neil reached for the dog slowly, letting it smell his hand first, and when it didn't snap at him he scooped it up, feeling ribs through wet fur that suggested this animal hadn't been eating well recently. Getting out of the drain was significantly harder than getting in, because now he had to climb one-handed while holding a terrified dog against his chest with the other arm, and the concrete was slippery and offered almost no good handholds. He managed it through a combination of determination and fear of being stuck in a storm drain overnight, pushing the dog up first and then hauling himself out, scraping his arms and getting his clothes even more destroyed in the process. Once they were both on solid ground, Neil carried the dog to his car and set it on an old towel he kept in the back seat, and in better light he could see it was a Jack Russell Terrier, white with brown patches, wearing a collar that had a tag. The tag was muddy but readable, engraved with a name Biscuit and a phone number with an Austin area code. Neil pulled out his phone and dialed, and after 4 rings a woman answered, her voice tight with stress. "Hello? Hi, I found a dog that I think might be yours. Name tag says Biscuit. Jack Russell Terrier. Pulled him out of a storm drain off Riverside Drive." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God, you found Biscuit. Is he okay? Where are you?" "He seems okay, little banged up and definitely scared, but he's breathing fine and responding to touch. I'm at the corner of Riverside and Pleasant Valley. Been here about 5 minutes." "Stay there, please stay there. I'm sending someone to you right now, should be there in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you so much, you have no idea what this means." She sounded like she was crying, and Neil felt awkward about the intensity of her reaction even though he understood being upset about a lost pet. He sat in his car with the dog, who had stopped shaking and was now just lying on the towel looking exhausted, occasionally licking Neil's hand like it was trying to communicate gratitude. True to her word, a black SUV pulled up 9 minutes later, and a man in his 50s got out wearing expensive-looking casual clothes that were somehow managing to stay clean despite the weather. He approached Neil's window and Neil rolled it down. "You're the one who found Biscuit?" The man's voice was professionally friendly, the tone of someone used to managing situations. "Yeah, heard him barking in the storm drain, climbed down and got him out. He seems okay but probably should see a vet to make sure." "Absolutely. We're taking him straight to the emergency clinic. Mrs. Morrison wanted me to give you this for your trouble." He handed Neil an envelope, and Neil opened it to find 5 $100 bills, an amount that seemed excessive for rescuing a dog. But he wasn't about to argue with free money when his rent was due in 6 days. "That's generous. Tell Mrs. Morrison I'm glad I could help." The man carefully lifted Biscuit from the back seat, wrapping him in a cleaner towel he'd brought, and headed back to the SUV. Neil watched them drive away, and then looked at the envelope again. $500 for maybe 45 minutes of work that had left him muddy and exhausted, but apparently well compensated. He drove home, showered for 20 minutes trying to get the storm drain smell off his skin, and fell asleep thinking about the dog's eyes and the flashlight beam. 3 days later, Neil got a phone call from an unknown number, and when he answered, a woman's voice said, "Is this Neil Carpenter? The person who rescued Biscuit from the storm drain?" "Yeah, that's me. Is the dog okay?" "He's perfect. The vet said he was dehydrated and had some minor scrapes, but otherwise he's completely healthy, which is miraculous considering he was missing for 8 hours during that storm. I'm Catherine Morrison, Biscuit's owner, and I wanted to thank you personally and also ask if you'd be willing to meet with me. I'd like to do something more substantial to show my appreciation." Neil figured this was probably going to be more money, or maybe a gift basket, the kind of thing wealthy people did when they wanted to feel like they'd adequately compensated someone for a service. "Sure, I can meet. When works for you." They met at a coffee shop in downtown Austin 2 days later, and Catherine Morrison turned out to be a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a style that probably cost more than Neil's monthly grocery budget, wearing simple but clearly expensive clothing, and carrying herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about money. She stood when Neil walked in, shaking his hand firmly and gesturing to a table where she'd already ordered 2 coffees. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this is probably unusual, but I wanted to explain something about Biscuit and why his rescue means more to me than just getting my pet back." She sat down, and Neil sat across from her, still not entirely sure what this meeting was about. "Biscuit was my husband's dog. Robert died 14 months ago, heart attack, completely unexpected, and Biscuit was the last living connection I had to him. Robert got him as a puppy 6 years ago, trained him, took him everywhere, and after Robert died, Biscuit was the thing that got me out of bed in the morning, because he needed to be walked and fed and cared for. When he disappeared during the storm, when I thought I'd lost him too, it felt like losing Robert all over again." Neil felt uncomfortable with the intimacy of this information, with being pulled into someone's grief when he'd just been trying to help a trapped animal. "I'm sorry about your husband, and I'm glad I could get Biscuit back to you, but you already paid me way more than necessary for what I did. The $500 was immediate gratitude, not compensation. What I want to offer you now is different, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of a house, a sprawling property with a gate and a circular driveway and architecture that screamed wealth. "This is where I live, about 5 miles from where you found Biscuit." The storm swept him away from our property, probably when our fence got damaged by a fallen tree, and he ended up in that drainage system, traveling through underground pipes until he got stuck where you found him. The fact that he survived, that he ended up somewhere someone could hear him and care enough to climb into a storm drain to help, that feels like something I should acknowledge properly. "Okay, I'm listening." Neil had no idea where this was going, but the intensity in her voice suggested it was somewhere significant. "I'm the CEO of Morrison Technologies. We develop software for data security and enterprise solutions, and I'm worth about $3 billion, give or take depending on the stock market on any given day. Robert built the company from nothing, and I took over when he died even though I'd been semi-retired, because letting it fail would have dishonored everything he worked for. I'm telling you this not to brag, but to establish that I have resources most people don't, and I want to use some of those resources to change your life the way you changed mine by bringing Biscuit home." Neil felt his brain trying to process what she was saying, the disconnect between climbing into a storm drain and apparently being about to receive something significant from a billionaire. "Mrs. Morrison, I appreciate the thought, but I didn't rescue your dog expecting anything beyond maybe a thank you. I don't need my life changed." "Maybe not, but I looked into your background, which I hope doesn't feel invasive, but I needed to understand who you are. You work at an auto parts store making $42,000 a year. You're single. You rent a 1-bedroom apartment. You have student loans from a degree you never finished because you ran out of money. And you're basically living paycheck to paycheck doing a job that doesn't challenge you or make you happy. Am I wrong about any of that?" Neil felt exposed, like she'd peeled back his life and examined all the parts he tried not to think about. "No, that's accurate, but it's also none of your business." "You're right, it isn't, except you saved the most important thing in my life right now, and that makes me feel obligated to offer you opportunities you wouldn't have otherwise. I'm not offering charity, I'm offering investment in someone who demonstrated character and capability by risking their own safety to help a trapped animal." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "Morrison Technologies has an opening for a junior operations manager, starting salary $75,000 with full benefits and stock options. The job involves coordinating between different departments, managing logistics, solving problems, basically the kind of organizational skills you're already using at the auto parts store, but applied to something with actual growth potential. I'm offering you the position if you want it, no strings attached. You'd interview with the department head like any other candidate, but I'll tell you right now you'd get hired because I've reviewed your work history, and you're competent and reliable, which is more valuable than most people realize." Neil looked at the folder without opening it, his mind racing through implications and suspicions and disbelief. "Why would you do this?" "I pulled a dog out of a drain. That doesn't qualify me to work at a tech company. You climbed into a storm drain in the middle of a flood to rescue an animal you'd never met. That demonstrates judgment and courage and compassion, which are qualities I value more than credentials. And you're right, you're not qualified for a technical position. But operations management doesn't require programming knowledge. It requires the ability to organize complex systems and solve problems under pressure. And you clearly can do both." Neil opened the folder and saw a formal job offer, complete with salary breakdown and benefits package and a start date 3 weeks out. "This is real? This isn't some elaborate thank you gesture that disappears once I accept? It's completely real, legally binding contract. The position exists whether you take it or not. I'm not creating a fake job to make you feel special. I'm offering you an actual role that needs to be filled and you're qualified to fill." He stared at the papers, thinking about his apartment and his student loans and his job that paid barely enough to survive, thinking about climbing into a storm drain because a dog was stuck and that moment of decision feeling obvious even though it was objectively stupid. "Can I think about this? I need a couple days to process." "Take a week. The offer stands until then, and if you decide it's not for you, I'll respect that decision and we'll part ways with my gratitude intact." Neil left the coffee shop with the folder, drove home in a daze, and spent 3 days researching Morrison Technologies, reading about Catherine Morrison, trying to find the catch, because nothing in his life had prepared him for the possibility that helping someone could result in opportunities this significant. His sister Paula, who lived in Houston and worked as a teacher, told him he'd be an idiot not to take the job. This is one of those moments where the universe hands you something, and you either grab it or spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had. Take the job, see what happens, worst case scenario it doesn't work out, and you go back to inventory management. He called Catherine on the 6th day and told her he was accepting the offer, and she sounded genuinely pleased rather than surprised. "You'll start 3 weeks from Monday. HR will contact you about paperwork and orientation. I think you're going to do well, Neil. You've got instincts that can't be taught." The job turned out to be challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated, requiring him to learn new systems and coordinate with people who had advanced degrees and years of experience. But Catherine had been right about his organizational skills translating. Within 6 months, he'd been promoted to senior operations manager with a salary increase that put him at $90,000 a year, and he'd paid off half his student loans and moved into a better apartment and started thinking about finishing his degree online. Catherine checked in occasionally, casual emails asking how things were going, inviting him to company events where Biscuit sometimes made appearances as the unofficial mascot, and Neil gradually understood that she'd meant what she said about investing in someone who'd demonstrated character, that this wasn't temporary gratitude, but genuine belief in his potential. 2 years after pulling a dog from a storm drain, Neil was making 6 figures as a director of operations, managing teams and projects that affected how the company functioned, and sometimes he'd think about that Wednesday evening in the rain, about hearing those faint barks and making the split-second decision to stop and investigate instead of driving home, about how that single choice had cascaded into a completely different life trajectory, and he'd visit Catherine occasionally for coffee, where she'd ask about his work and share stories about Robert and Biscuit, who was now 10 years old and slowing down but still living comfortably in. And Catherine would say things like, "Character reveals itself in crisis, and the best investments are in people who don't know their own worth yet." And Neil would think about how rescuing one dog had somehow rescued him too, pulling him out of a life that had felt stuck and offering him something he'd stopped believing was possible, which was the chance to actually use his abilities in ways that mattered, all because he'd been willing to climb into a storm drain when most people would have kept driving.